Hello, welcome back to the Beaming Quilt class. I am so excited to have you join me today. Welcome to week 3 of the class. If you are just now joining in, make sure that you check out week 1 where I talk about everything you need to know about picking out your fabrics for making your beaming quilt. And then also lesson 2, which is where I talk all about cutting out your fabrics for your beaming quilt, either using a traditional rotary cutter or an AccuQuilt fabric cutting machine. This pattern includes instructions for both, so I walk you through a little bit about how to get started on the cutting. Now here we are on lesson 3. This week is all about making our flying geese units in our beaming quilts. So as always, we'll start off by reading the pattern. I'm going to start off every lesson by going over the pattern because this is where you'll find all the details that you need to know. So we're going to go ahead and flip to the flying geese units section of the pattern. You should have a page dedicated to the flying geese. The pattern uses the 4 at a time method. So if you've never tried this method before, it's one of my personal favorites and I highly recommend it. You can see the amount of flying geese that you need does change depending on the size quilt that you're making. So you actually need 4 flying geese per block on your quilt. So as you can tell, I'm making the throw size. I have the throw size behind me as well. We're going to make 80 flying geese this week. If you're making the baby size quilt, you'll just make 36 flying geese. Or if you're making the bed size quilt, you'll make 168 flying geese. So regardless of which size quilt you're making, this week is the week to make all your flying geese. Today I'm going to walk you through how to make the flying geese using 2 different methods. First off, I'm going to walk you through the 4 at a time flying geese method, and then I'll switch over for those of you using AccuQuilt pieces for your flying geese. So you'll only make 1 at a time, but everything is already perfectly cut, so there's no trimming needed. Feel free to use the chapters listed below at this video so that you can navigate to the specific part of the video that you're hoping to find. First things first, let's go ahead and make 1 set of flying geese using a 7.5-inch piece of background fabric and 4 4-inch squares of the same color of your start colors. So you'll see here I'm using my navy background square, and then for this example I'll go ahead and use this dotted pink fabric so that you can see the right and the wrong side of the fabric throughout my example. We're always going to sew right sides together. So if you're new to quilting, make sure that you're sewing right sides together and pay attention to which side has the dots on it in my example. So before we dive in, the first step is to draw a diagonal line across the wrong side of all 4 of your 4-inch squares. You can do that a couple different ways, and I'm going to show you 3 options here. The first way that I'll demonstrate is using a ruler and a heat erasing pen like this one. A heat erasing pen like this, literally the ink erases when you iron it. So it's really a fun tool to use for quilting. I'll link some in the description below for you. But you'll just line up your ruler from one diagonal to the other. And then you'll take your pen and draw a diagonal line. And you could do that on all of your pieces on the wrong side of your fabric. Another method that you could do if you don't have a heat erasing pen, I use a hair marker. So this is a really neat 2-sided tool. This side is for turning points. It's a point turner. And then this is a kind of a sharp plastic edge that I use to mark lines as well. So I'll line up the ruler again and then take the hair marker, and then you can see there is like a super faint line. We don't have to worry about erasing it later on or anything. And then there's a third method as well, where I'm going to fold the square on the diagonal and then I'll press it with a hot iron real quick. So you'll see I use the nice hot iron to press it and create a crease, and then you can see that line on the wrong side of the fabric. So feel free to mark your squares any way that works best for you. I personally prefer the heat erasing pen. So I'm going to do that process for my entire stack of these 4-inch squares. So you'll see I've got a whole bunch of them. I'm going to go to the wrong side of the fabric and draw the lines like so. Now I do want to point out, when it comes to solid fabrics, if you have solids in your quilt, there is not really a right side and a wrong side, so just pick one and you'll be good to go on that. So you can go ahead and draw your diagonal lines on your whole stack, or you can just grab the 4 squares, the 4 4-inch squares and the 1 7.5-inch background square, and we'll start making our 4 flying geese. So you'll see we have our 4 squares. I'm going to go ahead and set 2 of the squares aside for later. We'll start off with our big background square. Of course, it's a solid, but we're going to pick whatever side we're going to decide is the wrong side of the fabric. And we're going to lay these right sides together. So we'll start off with 1 square, lining up the corners, or maybe even just a smidge inside the corners, just a tiny bit. And you can feel free to grab your pins and pin this in place like so. Then we'll go ahead and grab the other one. On the diagonal, we're going to line up so that we have one long straight diagonal line and pin it on the opposite side. Again, maybe just a smidge inside the corners, just a tiny bit. And we can go ahead and pin that one in place as well. Now, using our sewing machine, we're going to go ahead and stitch a 1/4 inch on each side of this long straight diagonal line. You'll see I already have this little piece of fabric sewn underneath my needle of my machine. This is what I like to call a leader or an ender. It basically is a scrap piece of fabric that I stitch on before I actually start sewing on my pieces, and that'll kind of grab my threads and be easier for them not to get sucked down into the machine itself. And as a little tip, I'm using 50 weight cotton thread that matches the background fabric, so it's navy blue thread, which I think you'll be able to see really well once I start stitching on this on the wrong side of this pink fabric. It'll show up really well for you, but you can use whatever thread color matches your background fabric or will blend in best with your project. So now I'll go ahead and stitch using the 1/4 inch foot on my machine along that straight line that I drew. Now when you get close to the pin, go ahead and pull that pin out. We don't want to stitch over the pins. Once you get to the end of your piece, go ahead and flip your piece around and we'll stitch again on the opposite side of the line. And then we'll stitch again on our ender. And that will be there for us on the next seam that we sew. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut down directly on the center line that we drew, and then I'm going to press our pieces open. So now you can do this step with scissors, but I prefer to use a rotary cutter and then just use any straight edge ruler. So I happen to use the one that I'm going to use later on, but feel free to use any straight edge ruler and your rotary cutter and just carefully cut directly on that line that we had drawn earlier. So now we have 2 pieces that each have a 1/4 inch seam, and next step is to go ahead and press these open. You'll see we have this little shape of kind of a heart with a little tiny overlap right here in the middle. Now, if you have a wool pressing mat like this one, I highly recommend using it for this step, but if not, a normal ironing board will definitely work. The first thing I'll do is lay out my flying geese, and I will press that seam just to set the stitches in nice and flat. And then I'll go ahead and just grab one, and I'll press these seams open. So very carefully opening it up with my fingernail and then finger pressing that seam open just gently, and then coming in with the hot iron to really make it more crisp. And then when we flip it over, you can see we have our nice piece, just like in figure 1D of the pattern. And then I'll repeat that with the opposite side. Now we'll take these pieces back over to our sewing machine and the other 2 pink 4-inch squares. So now just go ahead and grab one of your units and one of your matching 4-inch squares, place it right sides together and line up the corner here. You'll notice here that if we were to sew on the side of this line, we would be able to flip this piece up and we would have a flying geese right there. And then if we were to sew on this side of the line, we'd flip this piece up and have a second flying geese right there. So before you start sewing, feel free to test that in place so that you make sure that you're sewing the right direction. But I'll go ahead and line it up again, just a little smidge inside the background square, and we can go ahead and pin that in place. Now we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of that line, just like we did earlier. So I'll start off going this direction. Making sure not to sew over the pin. I'll go ahead and trim off that leader. And then we'll sew going this direction. And then we'll repeat that same process on the other side. Now we'll go ahead and repeat the process we did earlier where we cut directly on the center line and then we press all of our seams open. Now that we've cut our pieces apart directly on that center line, we can go ahead and press our seams open just like we did earlier using a nice hot iron. So I'll go ahead and finger press first and then come in behind with the iron, letting that get it nice and crisp. Now, when I do my flying geese this way, I have a little secret to share with you. There is often a little tiny piece of fabric, a little extra piece of fabric buried inside your flying geese. This one's right here. It might be like just that teeny tiny piece. I like to pull those out and then go ahead and press it again. That just kind of makes sure that we have it nice and extra flat and we don't have any extra bulk in our seams. So now we repeat that pressing process for all 4 of our flying geese units. Now once you've pressed your flying geese, you might choose to add a little bit of best press just to get those crisp points. Now I want to bring your attention to the top of the flying geese. Make sure that we have a solid 1/4 inch between the point and the top of the fabric here, because that's going to be our seam allowance. So now we're going to take our 4 flying geese and trim them to the accurate size, making sure to keep that 1/4 inch right there. Now I'm going to show you how I trim using a couple different methods. The first one, this is my favorite ruler for trimming flying geese. It is called the wing clipper ruler, and I will put a link to it in the description below for you. You'll see here we have different sizes across, so 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5 by 3.5. So we're going to go ahead and follow the lines here as we line it up on our block. So now you can see this ruler has these little X's across the top. We're going to line up our edges roughly with the 6.5 by 3.5 lines, but the most important part when lining this up is that that X at the top matches up with the seams on our unit. That's how we make sure that we keep our seam allowance without trimming it off. So then I go ahead and take my ruler and trim across the side and the top. You'll see that also trims off this little piece that's called the dog ear. And then the next thing that we'll do is rotate the whole unit so then we can trim off the other two sides. This time it's less important to match up with that exact point because we're gonna line up along the left side 6.5 line and along the bottom 3.5 line. And then you'll also see we have these lines to line up as well. So all of those lines should line up nice and easy, and then we'll go ahead and trim off along the side and the bottom of the flying geese. When you're done, you should have a unit that looks just like that. So then you can go ahead and repeat that for all of your flying geese that need to be trimmed. Or if you don't have the wing clipper ruler like this one, I'll go ahead and show you how to do it using a normal square ruler. Now you'll see here I have my flying geese and just a regular square ruler. As long as it's at least 6.5 inches across, you're going to be fine. But before we actually start cutting, we're going to line up the 3.25 dot, if your ruler has a dot, and line that up right at the peak of your flying geese. And then we'll go ahead and just make sure that we're kind of relatively straight across the top and relatively straight across the bottom as well. So then I'll go ahead and trim off the excess. So you'll see we got that dog ear trimmed off, and then we'll rotate it and we'll do that same process that we did last time where we line up 6.5 by 3.5 on our ruler. And this time you should be able to also follow this line, this diagonal line. If your ruler has a diagonal line, we'll line up with that flying geese seam. So go ahead and hold it down and cut off your side and your bottom. And that's how you trim your flying geese using a traditional quilting ruler. So now we'll go ahead and trim all of our geese using whatever method you prefer. Once you have trimmed all of your flying geese to 3.5 inches by 6.5 inches, you're done with the flying geese portion of the beaming sew along. So go ahead and make sure that you take pictures and post your progress if you're sewing along with me. So now I want to dive into how to make flying geese using your AccuQuilt triangles. So if you were with me last week for our cutting, we cut out a bunch of quarter square triangles using our background fabric. These are 6.5 inches wide. Then we also cut out a bunch of quarter square triangles, which I have tons of these here in the pink fabrics. And these quarter square triangles, the long edge of the triangle will match up perfectly with the shorter edge of the quarter square triangle. So we're going to grab two of the same color pink triangles, or your star colors, and one of your background quarter square triangles, and then we'll sew one side on at a time and press in between. So it's super simple, and it's one of my favorite blocks to make using AccuQuilt. So go ahead and grab your triangles and let's head over to the sewing machine. All right, so you'll see here I've grabbed my quarter square triangle background fabric, and then two of these. They'll go on, one on each side of our geese to make our finished flying geese unit. I'll go ahead and just set one aside for now, and we'll start by lining up the right sides together and lining up the bottom corner so that those little points match up perfectly, and then line up the whole side seam. You'll see that there is just a little tiny overhang here at the top. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. So now we'll go ahead and line it up. Make sure that you have that leader on again to grab your threads back behind your needle. And I'll go ahead and stitch directly 1/4 inch away from the side. we'll cut off our leader and we'll sew it on as an ender. And you'll see our nice even seam. Next, we'll go ahead and press that seam open. And then back to sew on the other side. And now we repeat exactly what we already did. We're just going to be sewing the right sides together on for the other half of our flying geese. Go ahead and line up that corner again, right sides together, and line up the entire seam. This time, that side of your triangle should come even with the top so that all of your seams are nice and evenly fit together. And then stitch a 1/4 inch away. And now the last step here is to go ahead and press that seam open. And that's it. It really is that simple. So now, regardless of if you're making your flying geese using AccuQuilt or the 4 at a time method, you should be able to be all set to make all of your flying geese for this week of the sew along. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and make sure to check out the live Q&A session coming up. I'll post all of the details about that in the Patreon group. Good luck making your flying geese this week, and I'll see you back here next week while we make our scrappy hourglass units. Happy sewing!